two of America's most iconic buildings. One fateful day.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down.
You could begin to see the seams of the building begin to crumble.
Now, a new understanding of what went wrong.
Without the fireproofing, the steel heats up instantaneously.
And what went right.
There were cracks everywhere, yet it still stood.
The towers actually did a magnificent job.
"9/11, the Towers and the Pentagon." The terrorist attacks of 9/11 culminated in two of the biggest and most shocking structural collapses in American history. And it would take years and several forensic investigations for us to learn the exact reason why the Pentagon survived and why the Twin Towers had failed.
I was walking to work and all of a sudden I see a jet crash into the first tower.
At 8:46 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center was attacked first.
It shook like nothing I ever felt, and you're talking 3-4 blocks away.
At 9:02 a.m., as fire engulfed the North Tower, another 767 flew into the South Tower. A little over 30 minutes later, in Northern Virginia, at 9:38 a.m., a Pentagon security camera captured these images of a giant fireball exploding on the northwest side of the building.
You had this amazing icon of our nation, incredibly vulnerable through this gash in the building and this huge fire and the column of smoke. It was an incredible sight, and one that we knew we had to gain control of as quickly as possible.
Jim Schwartz of the Arlington County Fire Department was on the scene within minutes, trying to find the origin of the huge blaze threatening the building.
In a situation like this, where it is a massive fire, where it is fed with jet fuel that has been literally injected into the building, the task is far more gargantuan, because the Pentagon being one of the largest buildings in the world, there are 17.5 miles of hallway that make up this building.
And the Pentagon is not only massive, it's uniquely designed. This 5-sided building also has 5 stories and 5 concentric rings labeled A through E, which run from the inside to the outside.
We had indications that the aircraft had penetrated the first 3 rings of the Pentagon and created an opening on the interior wall of the C ring, where there actually is a roadway that is used to transport materials in between the rings of the Pentagon.
With other local fire departments joining in, the firefighters looked for survivors and tried to stem the fire raging inside the C, D, and E rings.
You couldn't see much inside. It was full of smoke. The debris piles were at least 4 feet high. So as we were making our way further back into the building, we were crawling over those debris piles with hoses trying to get the fires put out.
But the construction of the building was working against them. Construction that ironically began 60 years ago to the day, on September 11th, 1941. To save steel for the upcoming war, the Pentagon was built of reinforced concrete. It was completed in record time in January of 1943, almost a year and a half before D-Day. And although the Pentagon was never meant to withstand an attack, its floor system was heavily fortified.
Interesting thing about the Pentagon is that it was felt after the war, the nation would have no need for a headquarters of that size. It was anticipated that it might be used as an archive for records storage.
But now, 60 years later, on September 11th, 2001, this vault-like building posed a serious challenge to firefighters who were trying to ventilate it.
The roof is a concrete deck, so opening that was virtually impossible. And the number of windows in areas where the fire was burning was very limited. So our ability to get this heat out of the building was more limited than it is in a normal situation. Our firefighters reported to us that they experienced some of the most intense heat they had ever experienced before.
Approximately 20 minutes after the attack, the operational commanders on the west side of the Pentagon radioed that the crash zone in the E-ring was nearing collapse.
In fact, you could begin to see the seams of the building begin to crumble.
We were in there, I'd say about 5 minutes, and we could hear the rumble.
It was just a kind of a folding of that portion of the building, almost in a dramatic way, almost as if it was flowing a little bit. The collapse just sort of rolling down upon itself.
Structural engineer Dean Tills was with the first FEMA urban search and rescue team that made it to the scene.
The outside of the building did not show the condition what was on the inside of the structure. There was a lot more damage on the inside of the structure. And I know people watching it on TV really didn't get to understand how bad it was.
We were doing everything we could to position firefighters and their hose lines at various places in the Pentagon because it had spread so far.
They attacked the fire first with foam because of the jet fuel. When that proved successful, they switched to water to finish the job. But the firefighters could only stay inside for limited amounts of time before their air supply ran out.
It took you quite a while to get into the area where you were going to fight the fire. So necessarily your retreat path was going to take you quite a while to get out of there.
It took all day of the most grueling firefighting to bring the fires inside the building under control.
I've been in the fire service for 28 years. We saw more fire in one day than I saw in my entire career.
But with the fires finally extinguished, what they saw in its place was even more shocking.
Imagine about 3/4 of a football field, covered in debris, 4 feet deep, with wires and pipes and concrete pieces hanging. That's what it looked like inside. It was just mind-boggling.
When we finally got back to the fire station, it was filled with people, police, everybody, and they had television on, and that was the first time that we actually saw what had happened in New York.
In New York City on September 11th, just minutes after 9 a.m., the World Trade Center was engulfed in flames.
One floor of fire in a building that large would be extremely difficult for us to put out. This was beyond the capabilities of extinguishment.
But no one was prepared for what happened next.
I heard the sound, and although I never heard anything like it before, it took me a millisecond to realize what it was.
At 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after being hit, the South Tower rumbled to the ground.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down.
And half an hour later, at 10:28 a.m., the unimaginable happened again. In less than 2 hours that day, almost 3,000 people lost their lives from the collapse of both towers.
Chaos. It's just chaos out here, really. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy.
For those who survived, there was only horror and shock, as if the Great Pyramids themselves had fallen.
There had never been a collapse of a building even close to the height of these two.
Since it's the job of structural engineers to design buildings that protect life, the engineering community had to understand exactly what happened. So Dr. W. Gene Corley headed up a preliminary investigation.
The type of work we do in forensic studies of collapses is like an autopsy. We do go in and we look at individual parts of the building.
But in the case of the World Trade Center, those parts lay scattered among tons of rubble at ground zero. Within 2 weeks of the disaster, with recovery efforts still underway, Corley's team began its painstaking detective work. They met with the tower's original structural engineer, Leslie Robertson, and went over his plans for the World Trade Center. Completed in the early 1970s, it was a building known the world over as an engineering marvel.
If you look at skyscrapers, you find that the World Trade Center was designed in a completely different manner. Most of the skyscrapers that were built prior to that time had the structure that resists the wind and earthquakes on the inside of the building.
But at 110 stories high, the World Trade Center would be taller than any other skyscraper in the world. So Robertson had to find another way to design the buildings to resist the sideway bending caused by winds. His solution was nothing short of brilliant.
The towers had this tubular structure, and that is where the resistance was achieved.
To accomplish this, each tower had 4 basic components.
First, you have a traditional core. These are the columns in the core and the columns rising about 110 floors high. There are 47 such columns on the inside.
And what made this structure so technically innovative was its steel perimeter tube.
This is a series of massive columns that goes up all the way high in the building, ringed by very deep spandrel beams.
It's like a box, and the box can be very, very tall. And it was very clear from looking at the building that you could see that strength.
Each tower was topped by a hat truss, a set of steel braces that provided additional connections among the core columns and between the core and perimeter columns.
The purpose of the hat truss is twofold. It was to minimize the sway of the building in case of very strong winds, including hurricanes, but also to act as a supporting structure that would carry the television antenna that was at the top of WTC-1. Beyond that, you had the slabs.
The floor slabs consisted of 4-inch thick concrete on a steel deck, supported by a grid of steel bar trusses that connected to the perimeter tube. It was its unique design that made the World Trade Center such an extraordinary load-carrying structure.
A quick, easy way to see that, if I take a piece of paper, the minute I push on it, it obviously buckles or bends. Right? It doesn't have much of a load-carrying capacity. This is exactly that same piece of paper that's folded 4 ways to create a rectangular tube. It can carry a book as heavy as this one, and probably you can comfortably stack a couple of more books on top. It is such a redundant structure that if I cut a substantial hole into one of the sides of it, apply the same load, it still manages to remain stable.
In a skyscraper like this, redundancy, how a building redistributes its loads around a damaged area, is critical.
These buildings had a great deal of redundancy.
In fact, the World Trade Center's original engineers had even done calculations to see what would happen if a Boeing 707, a slightly smaller aircraft than the 767s involved in 9/11, struck the building by accident.
And they concluded that if an aircraft hit, that the buildings would not collapse, that they would be able to take that hit and stand up.
But while the Twin Towers were amazingly able to withstand the initial impact, it was a mystery to investigators why they ultimately failed. To try to solve it, Dr. Corley and his team began collecting vital evidence. They searched the scrapyard where the debris from the World Trade Center was being hauled, looking for clues in the steel. In particular, investigators were on the lookout for certain parts that form the building's steel perimeter wall, the outside tube which had helped stabilize the building after the crash.
The pieces of most interest to us were those in the vicinity of where the aircraft hit the building.
They found many of the pieces they were looking for, and after a rigorous investigation, they were able to rule out the steel itself as the cause of the Twin Towers collapse. It was up to code. But the steel had yielded an important clue, one that might eventually solve the mystery.
If we saw a piece of steel that was red in color, that told us the fireproofing had been knocked off, because the fireproofing is gray or white colored, but the steel without fireproofing is a reddish color.
Over 200 pieces of the steel were shipped to NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, where Dr. Shyam Sunder led the next phase of the federal investigation.
It became clear that the manner by which these buildings actually collapsed was not completely known even among the experts.
Dr. Sunder zeroed in on the steel from the crash site.
This particular piece is a very important piece for the investigation because it was the piece that was hit by the first plane to hit the towers, World Trade Center 1. This is another one of those very critical pieces, and there are two pieces basically, one on top, one on the bottom, and the plane coming right through. So this is probably the last that the hijackers saw before they encountered the building.
As part of their exhaustive investigation, NIST ran fire tests on samples of the 14 grades of steel used in the World Trade Center, with and without fireproofing.
We did tests at very fast rates of loading, similar to when an airplane would hit it, and also tests at high temperatures, similar to when the fires were affecting the properties of the steel. And of course, without the fireproofing, the steel heats up instantaneously, almost. With the fireproofing, there's a delay.
Investigators now believed the loss of fireproofing from the World Trade Center steel columns was most likely connected to the collapse of both towers, but they were determined to find out more.
The question was, we had two buildings that were nearly identical. They were hit by two nearly identical airplanes. How come one building lasts nearly twice as long as the other?
Coming up,
we knew that we were dealing with a very unstable structure.
By September 12th, after a day of extraordinary efforts, firefighters at the Pentagon had brought the raging inferno under control. Now, engineers could assess the devastation to the building caused by the crash of American Airlines Flight 77.
It actually impacted the southwest portion of the Pentagon at roughly the first floor level, flying pretty much straight and level, penetrating through 310 feet of the Pentagon.
Approximately 10% of the Pentagon had been destroyed when the plane penetrated 3 of its 5 rings.
The aircraft was disintegrating from this impact. It was disintegrating the contents of the offices, furniture, paper, computers, and it was all being pushed through the building. It was as if an avalanche had come through.
184 people died in the attack, 125 from the Pentagon, and 59 on board the aircraft. But in order for recovery operations and evidence collection to proceed, the structural engineers would have to stabilize the building. Firefighter Scott McKay led one of the technical rescue teams working with the engineers.
The most shocking thing to me was on September the 12th when I went in with the structural engineers, and they had determined that certain areas were absolutely unsafe. Well, those were the exact same areas we were in with the hose lines the day before. That sent a chill down your spine because all the columns were gone in those areas.
The columns in the Pentagon are approximately 20 feet on center everywhere. The airplane was really crashing into a forest of columns.
When structural engineer Dean Tills first saw the area adjacent to the collapse zone, he couldn't believe his eyes. He had no idea why it was still standing.
It was something that when you look at it and you think about it for a long time, it's very hard to say, yeah, that structure could stand. There were cracks everywhere, huge cracks through beams and through columns missing all over the place, yet it still stood.
Using a shoring system known as a box crib, They built huge columns that were 6 feet square and 14 feet high.
All the shoring we used in the Pentagon was all 6x6 dimensional lumber. And we ordered them actually from Home Depot. They delivered, I believe it was 20 tractor trailer loads of 16-foot 6x6s.
It was incredibly dangerous work. The building could fall down on them any minute.
There was still movement in the structure. The structure was relaxing, kind of slowly creeping down.
And we knew that we were dealing with a very unstable structure until we got those shoring columns in place. So it was a very precarious situation for a while. And there was electrical hazards still. A lot of uninterrupted power sources for computers. They were still in place and they were live. And they were hard to identify because they were burned and mangled.
Meanwhile, the technical teams were racing against time to prevent further collapse.
We had a number of cases where the columns were impacted so hard that all the concrete was knocked out of them, and they called that an empty cage. So you were just left with a steel reinforcing cage with no concrete.
The rebar that was used to provide support for the concrete was extremely large. Some of it was almost 1.5 inches in diameter, and it was incredibly strong.
During its construction 60 years ago, the Pentagon's concrete columns had been spirally reinforced, a particularly strong way of fortifying concrete, not as common today because of the cost. With most of the Pentagon stabilized, Dean Tills and the other structural engineers were ready to tackle the collapsed portion of the E-ring. But it was too hazardous for them to get close to it.
There was a roof slab leaning, and we weren't sure of whether that roof slab would stay in place. And if the roof slab were to give way, what it would do is slide down the structure, impact on the adjacent structure, which was severely damaged, and possibly bring that down.
They had to move it before it came crashing down. So they brought in a concrete pulverizer called a T-Rex.
It's more of a surgical piece of equipment that goes in and essentially chews like scissors around the damaged area, cutting away at it.
But even the T-Rex couldn't keep it from falling.
The guy that was actually using this piece of equipment was able to slow the descent of the slide with his equipment, so it did not impact as hard on the structure. I didn't realize, how big of a deal it was to the country in general until we finished our operations and drove home. Driving home was amazing to see all the flags up on the bridges and the people out, wishing us welcome home and stuff. It was quite an impact.
Coming up.
Many buildings with a smaller footprint might have collapsed immediately.
Shortly after the collapse of the World Trade Center, with federal investigations already underway, the building's leaseholder, Larry Silverstein, commissioned his own forensic investigation. He hired the firm of Weidlinger Associates with Najib Abood and Matisse Levy, two of the leading structural and forensic engineers in the world.
We actually ended up doing a very complete structural investigation from the moment of impact of the planes to the point where the structure began to collapse.
The way we do these analyses is that the term is discretize, cut up into small pieces all the objects that are involved in the event. And we apply the laws of physics to each one of those small pieces.
In their analysis, a Boeing 767, the type of aircraft that struck the Twin Towers, is modeled with 50,000 small pieces. The building, 700,000 pieces. Flying at 500 miles an hour, American Airlines Flight Number 11 struck the north face of the North Tower.
The airplane itself gets shredded, but those fragments continue their path through the building.
But it damaged the center of the face and also the center of the core of the building, which is the place where all the stairs and elevators and bathrooms are.
20 out of the 47 columns in the core were either severed or badly damaged. But the North Tower managed to restabilize, helped by the roof truss, originally designed to carry the television antennas.
That truss had the advantage of being able to pick up some of the interior columns and hang them from the top, transfer the loads to the outside.
Still, the tower was being undermined by thousands of airplane fragments flying through the building.
And in fact, what it was also doing was stripping off the fireproofing that was in there to protect the structure under normal fires. If you're just losing 10 or 20% of the insulation on the fireproofing, you'll have a large effect.
And that's what happened to the core columns in the North Tower.
This is the zone where we believe the fireproofing was substantially stripped off.
The South Tower, which was hit by United Airlines flight number 175, lost 29 out of 59 columns on its south face.
However, it is their location that is important. They were at the corner of the core, and therefore introducing this eccentricity in the damage.
Each airplane was carrying a large amount of fuel, 10,000 gallons.
But that fuel was largely consumed over the first minute, partially in fireballs that people could see from the outside, partially within the building. The damage here is created by the burning of the contents that were already in the building. The jet fuel you can think of as a very big match. It started fires on multiple floors over large areas all at once. That's a big deal.
As other investigations also revealed, the strength of steel without fireproofing degrades dramatically at temperatures like those in the World Trade Center that day.
By the time it's up to about 1,100 to 1,300 Fahrenheit, it's lost half of its strength. And when we get up into the 16, 1,800 Fahrenheit, it basically has no strength left. So when it's losing its strength, obviously it can no longer fulfill its structural purpose.
This is a graphic of the columns of the South Tower before the attack. The green indicates that the structural load on the building is within its capacity.
In the undamaged state on that day, it's all green. Actually, less than 20% of the available capacity of the tower is in use.
But although the roof truss played such a vital role in helping to stabilize the building after it lost many of its columns, it too began to fail, weakened by the fires.
It finally hit a point where those columns could no longer support the floors above. And in the South building, of course, there were a lot more floors above than there were in the North building.
Along the east face, between floor 78 and 84, you see this band of red that is traveling down the eastern face of the building, creating a zipper-like effect. The top of the building tilted a little bit before coming down. That tilt, a southeasterly tilt, corresponds to that zipper.
So then the columns gave way and the whole building began to pancake down.
Why did the South Tower fall after 56 minutes, while the North Tower remained standing for 103 minutes after the attack? It had to do with the damage pattern in the core.
In the North Tower, it's central, it is symmetric, as opposed to the South Tower, where it is not central, it is eccentric.
In the North Tower, it was primarily the core where the collapse began.
If you keep your eye on the roof antenna, you will see it started sinking in before the perimeter tube starts sinking in. It substantiates that the core gave in first at the impact floors, not elsewhere, started coming down, and then dragged along the perimeter tube.
In September of 2005, after a 3-year investigation, NIST came out with a similar conclusion. But they believe the collapse initiated in the floors.
The floors started to sag, and they started to pull the exterior columns inward. And the inward bowing of the exterior columns became substantial just before collapse. And then the building came down.
Still, both towers lasted long enough to allow thousands of people below the impact areas to evacuate safely. Not all skyscrapers would have done as well.
Many buildings have a smaller footprint than the wingspan of the airplane and might have collapsed immediately.
Coming up, how to make buildings more blast resistant.
As a projectile comes down through the gun tube,
Over 1,000 miles from the Pentagon, tucked away in Vicksburg, Mississippi, is the Research and Development Center for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Fire in the hole.
With experimental facilities like these, the Corps is world famous for its research into blasts.
Here we study the response of buildings to blast and other extreme loadings.
Dr. Paul Malacher is one of the Corps' top senior research scientists. Soon after 9/11, Dr. Malacher was asked by the American Society of Civil Engineers to head up a forensic study to evaluate how the Pentagon had withstood the attack. Arriving on the scene September 14th, Malacher was taken by an FBI agent to the spot 310 feet into the building where the debris field ended.
And he very proudly pointed to me, "That's where we recovered the black box last night." And I looked at where he was pointing, and the nose gear of the aircraft is there. And I said to myself, something's wrong there, because I know the black box is in the tail of every airplane to increase its chance of survivability. And it took a little while to sort this out. We had an airplane weighing 182,000 pounds, traveling at 530 miles an hour.
It was flying so low that it knocked down light poles in its path before slicing into the building diagonally at the first story. The initial impact destroyed or compromised 50 columns and severely weakened another 30 before coming to rest in approximately 0.8 of a second.
And what had happened is that as the plane disintegrated and traveled through the building, the back of the airplane collapsed onto the front of the airplane.
At the time of the attack, the Pentagon was in the initial phase of a massive renovation project. As part of this renovation, it was Dr. Malacher and his fellow engineers in Vicksburg that had helped design the Pentagon's protection against terrorist attack. By sheer coincidence, the terrorists on 9/11 had managed to strike the only part of the Pentagon that had already been retrofitted. The difference between the two sections was astonishing.
There was actually a brick wall that separated two offices near the corridor 5 side. And on one side of the wall was an office that was quite occupiable, that you could move in there tomorrow. And on the other side, it was a totally burned out office. There was just ash everywhere.
The part of the building most severely affected by the crash was in the newly renovated section, and what happened here was nothing short of miraculous. Although the first floor and part of the second floor were destroyed, the remaining 3 floors survived for 20 minutes, suspended in midair.
The people directly above the point of impact in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors all got out before the structure collapsed. So that was a very, very important factor in their survival.
In a scenario much like the collapse of the Twin Towers, the heat of the fire weakened the steel, which here was encased in concrete columns.
When we examine all the columns that were destroyed by the aircraft impact, what is amazing is that not more of the Pentagon collapsed than did.
The Pentagon's success in withstanding the ravages of 9/11 was all the more remarkable since the engineers designed its protection for a very different kind of attack.
Some provision was made for the possibility of a vehicular bomb from outside the Pentagon.
Experiments like these helped them determine which materials to use to harden the building's defenses.
this is the impact and explosion effects branch, and we look at projectiles as they impact structures. We look at material properties and how they respond. This is our 83 millimeter powder gun, which is part of our projectile penetration facility.
These are some of the various projectiles, all modeled to scale.
And what we're looking at right here is the breech section where we actually will load our projectiles in, whatever they happen to be. We'll put a powder charge in there.
This camera, which runs at 100 million frames per second, captures the blast. The engineers then run the data through their supercomputers, some of the fastest in the world. This enables them to test various kinds of bombs against different buildings without doing any damage. But the experiments and computations are only part of their process. They also need the real thing.
It's very important to look at the way structures perform in actual events.
That's why the Army engineers studied past attacks, like the bombings on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, and Oklahoma City. And they learned an important lesson.
In the Oklahoma City bombing, most of the casualties came from the collapse of the building itself, but most of the injuries to people that survived the bombing came from glass breakage or other debris flying.
To try to prevent those kinds of injuries, the Pentagon's exterior walls were strengthened with an earlier version of a fiber-reinforced polymer like this.
So that when this wall is subjected to a blast loading, it will shatter like an ordinary concrete block wall. But this film will keep those fragments from flying into the room and injuring the occupants.
And the Pentagon also got brand new windows that looked like ordinary ones, but were in fact blast resistant.
The windows are resistant to a blast up to a certain level. They are designed beyond that level to fail gracefully. That is, the glass shatters, but is retained within the frame.
On 9/11, almost all the conventional windows in the unrenovated section were destroyed, while most of the blast-resistant windows survived.
The blast-resistant windows were quite sturdy, quite durable. They allowed the structure to stand for a longer period before it collapsed.
I'm absolutely convinced that the way that Pentagon was constructed is why we're sitting here talking today and I didn't get killed on September the 11th.
Coming up, a dazzling new skyscraper for the post-9/11 world.
I believe that this is the safest skyscraper in the United States.
Although experts now understood how and why the Twin Towers failed, there was one other mystery that remained from that day: Number 7 World Trade Center. Number 7 was a 47-story skyscraper with a relatively common design, which stood some 300 feet from the North Tower, Number 1 World Trade Center.
When Tower 1 collapsed, it set fire to Building 7. Prior to that time, there was no sign of fire in Building 7. So we believe that's when the fire started.
We could see fires on various floors, and we could see some structural damage to the south side.
So they sent in a team of experts to take a close look at the damage.
Everyone that we sent said the same thing, that we would not be able to put out the fires. We were having difficulty with water supply, and that the building was structurally damaged to the point that we should anticipate a collapse.
At 3:30 p.m., Nigro ordered the evacuation of Number 7. And almost 2 hours later, after burning for 7 hours,
we have very good video of the building's collapse. And a few seconds before the collapse really got going, one penthouse disappeared. So that tells us the collapse had started.
At 5:21 p.m., Number 7 became the third building in the World Trade Center complex to collapse. But this collapse was different, and structural engineers needed to know why.
We had no airplane impact, no fireproofing being knocked off in 7. So the question was, why did this particular building collapse?
It's a question that has given rise to litigation and conspiracy theories. But after years of investigation, NIST believes they have found an answer.
We are saying the floors heated up, and through some combination of thermal effects, expansion or sagging, there were connection failures and beam failures as a result of that, which led to a single column, one column that had a large unsupported length. And that one column, the critical column, buckled, which brought the whole building down.
This is what's called a progressive collapse, in which the failure of one element causes the failure of the entire building. And number 7's collapse was perhaps even more relevant to high-rise safety today.
This is a phenomenon that has not previously happened, but we have never had progressive collapse associated with a fire.
In 2006, the last building to fall on September 11th, number 7 World Trade Center, became the first to rise on ground zero.
I believe that this is the safest skyscraper in the United States. This building is a prototype for buildings, high-rise buildings of the future. We were obviously very conscious of the issues dealing with the events of 9/11, and we're attempting to address those.
And as experts learned, one of those issues was the need for better fireproofing.
And this is the kind of fireproofing that was used in the World Trade Center, and it provides insulation so that heat can't get into the steel. However, I can push on it and it crushes or compresses. So it's not as robust a material. Since 9/11, what's required in high-rise buildings has changed to be something more like this material. And this, I can't compress. It rings. It's a harder material, and that's what we're using now.
The new number 7 World Trade Center has also addressed the issue of evacuation. At the World Trade Center on 9/11, the attack destroyed almost all the stairwells above the area of impact, costing many people their lives. Those stairs had been clustered in the building's core.
You want them spread out so that there are alternative ways of getting out of the building. And the second is you want those means of egress to be a little bit more protected.
And here in number 7 World Trade Center, those stairwells are.
The stairs are located within a reinforced concrete core. And to make the stairs reliable, one of the things we did was to separate them as widely as possible, and we placed them behind reinforced concrete walls, so to provide additional protection for those stairs.
And not only are the stairwells well protected, they are 66 inches wide, broader by several inches than those found in most buildings this high.
Which allows people to move down in parallel, 2 people side by side, or one line of people exiting and emergency responders coming up in the opposite direction.
And if heavy smoke obscures this exit sign during a fire emergency, Galeotto's team has added another one closer to the ground, where it is more likely to be visible.
We have led the way, and I'd like to think that we certainly influenced the local laws that came to effect in New York City regarding high-rise design.
And on a national level, Dr. Sunder and NIST have been in the forefront with similar recommendations for skyscraper safety.
And I'm incredibly happy to say that 8 specific changes to the building code in the United States were approved a year ago.
But still, the lessons learned from 9/11 can only be taken so far.
We should not be designing buildings to withstand airplane impacts. In fact, it's much more cost-effective as a society to have terrorists be kept away from airplanes and airplanes away from buildings.